This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to our exploration of the Thucydides Trap. In this narration, we step into a high-stakes vision of 2026, where the leaders of the United States and China meet in Beijing to navigate the most consequential rivalry of our time. We'll delve into the digital siege of modern diplomacy, the volatile trigger of Taiwan, and the race for technological supremacy. Can history's most dangerous pattern be broken? Join us as we analyze the theater, the transactions, and the strategic battle to avoid a global catastrophe. Chapter 1. The Beijing Summit. Theater, Transaction, and the Trap. In May of 2026, the eyes of the world were fixed on Beijing as two men, representing the most powerful nations on Earth, walked together through the historic Temple of Heaven. It was a scene filled with the kind of grand pageantry that only a state visit to China can produce. There were booming cannons, the rhythmic marching of an honor guard, and hundreds of school children waving both American and Chinese flags. For Donald Trump, returning to China for the first time in his second term, it was a moment of personal diplomacy and high-stakes theater. The atmosphere was celebratory yet surreal. President Xi Jinping opened the proceedings by offering his formal congratulations to Trump on the upcoming 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States. Xi spoke of the weight of history, acknowledging the milestone of 1776 to 2026, while Trump, never one to miss a branding opportunity, spoke enthusiastically of his plans for a great American state fair and a marquee UFC fight night to mark the occasion. The summit took place against a backdrop of immense global turbulence. The international situation was described by the Chinese leadership as a transformation not seen in a century. For the United States, the stakes were incredibly high. The administration was navigating the fallout of the Liberation Day tariffs of April 2025, an aggressive economic maneuver that had seen average levies on Chinese goods surge by as much as 145 percentage points. This sharp protectionist turn had caused China's share of American imports to plummet from 22% down to just 9% in a little over a year. Meanwhile, the Pentagon was reporting that China had expanded its nuclear arsenal to over 600 operational warheads, with projections to exceed 1,000 by the end of the decade. As the two leaders sat across from each other in the Great Hall of the People, the personal dynamic provided a fascinating contrast in styles. Donald Trump employed what he calls the weave, a tangential, improvisational speaking style that moved from trade deficits to personal anecdotes about world leaders, then back to the strength of the U.S. stock market. He leaned into his personal relationship with Xi, calling him a great leader and an honorable friend, looking for tangible, transactional wins that he could bring home to his base. Trump's approach was rooted in the belief that a sufficiently large deal, purchases of American oil, agricultural products, and manufactured goods, could smooth over any geopolitical rift. Xi Jinping, however, was playing a much longer game. He remained structured and historical, framing the meeting not as a series of deals, but as a fundamental test of whether two civilizations could coexist. Behind the smiles and the ceremonial handshakes, Xi posed a question that has haunted historians and military strategists for over 2 millennia. He asked if their two nations could avoid the Thucydides Trap. To the casual observer, the term might sound like an academic footnote, but for Beijing, it is the very foundation of their strategic outlook. The phrase refers to the dangerous structural stress that occurs when a rising power threatens to displace an established ruling power. It is named after the Athenian general who chronicled the Peloponnesian War, concluding that it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this rise instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable.
By invoking this trap in 2026, Xi was issuing a warning. He was suggesting that the current friction, the trade wars and the military posturing in the Pacific, is not merely a series of isolated disputes, but a symptom of a deeper shift in the global balance of power. In this modern analogy, an assertive China plays the role of Athens while the United States represents Sparta. The danger, as she framed it, is that the fear of decline on one side and the ambition of growth on the other could create a cycle of suspicion and miscalculation that leads to a catastrophic collision. Trump, ever the pragmatist, reportedly quipped that the Thucydides Trap sounded like a beautiful name for a golf course, a remark that highlighted the persistent gap between his business-first mindset and the historical gravity that she was projecting.
This search for a new paradigm was reflected in the extraordinary guest list for the summit. Trump had brought with him a delegation of powerful business leaders representing a form of business statecraft. Among them were Kelly Ortberg, the CEO of Boeing, and Jane Fraser of Citigroup. Their presence was a reminder that despite the Liberation Day tariffs, the two economies remained deeply, if painfully, entangled. The logic was that if the two nations could find enough transactional common ground, the cost of war would remain prohibitively high. In a significant, if narrow, breakthrough during the talks, both leaders agreed that the Strait of Hormuz must remain open and free of tolls to stabilize global energy markets. Xi even expressed interest in buying more American oil, specifically to reduce China's dependence on volatile maritime corridors. Yet, even as they toasted to a brighter future at a lavish state banquet, the ghost of Thucydides remained in the room. Xi offered a toast that was strategically calculated, telling Trump that the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and the movement to make America great again could go hand in hand. It was a rare moment where a Chinese leader aligned his own nationalistic slogans with the specific political branding of an American president. By doing so, Xi was testing whether the established power was ready to accept the reality of a rising peer. The 2026 summit ended with a public invitation for Xi to visit the White House later that year, suggesting a period of temporary stability. Trump left Beijing in an optimistic mood, boasting of his friendship with the Chinese leader and predicting a historic improvement in ties. But the underlying structural stress that the Thucydides Trap describes has not disappeared. It is a fundamental power dynamic that exists regardless of the personalities involved. Even as the two nations agreed to buy each other's oil and aircraft, their militaries continued to shadow each other in the South China Sea, and their scientists raced to achieve breakthroughs that could render the other's defenses obsolete. The significance of Xi Jinping bringing up this ancient Greek theory cannot be overstated. It tells us that the Chinese leadership views the current era as one of profound historical risk. By framing the relationship through this lens, Xi is challenging the United States to prove that history does not have to repeat itself. He is asking if the world's two largest economies can navigate a shift in the global order without destroying the very civilization they both seek to lead. As the pageantry of the Beijing summit faded, the reality of this structural competition remained. The business deals and the personal rapport provided a temporary truce, but they did not resolve the core anxiety of a ruling power watching its challenger grow stronger. While the two leaders found common ground on trade and energy security, the issue of Taiwan remained a jagged edge, a thorny problem that no amount of personal diplomacy or weave could smooth over. During the private talks, Xi's tone shifted from the academic to the existential, signaling that the island remained the primary obstacle to a lasting peace and the most sensitive point of friction in the entire Pacific theater. The 2026 summit was a moment of recognition, a public acknowledgement that the trap is set and that both sides are standing dangerously close to it. But as the leaders looked toward their next series of engagements, the most volatile trigger of all remained unresolved, sitting at the heart of their rivalry like a dormant volcano. If there is one place where the theoretical trap could suddenly and violently become a reality, it is a small island located just 100 miles off the Chinese coast. Can the transactional brilliance of a deal-making president and the historical long game of a Chinese revolutionary find a way to manage the one issue that history suggests is unmanageable? Chapter 2. The Final Wound.
If the Thucydides Trap is the structural frame of the house, then Taiwan is the room where the fire is most likely to start. Throughout history, great wars rarely begin with a direct, premeditated attack by one superpower on the heart of another. Instead, they are often ignited by a dispute over a third party, a smaller ally, a strategic territory, or a peripheral interest that suddenly becomes a test of will. In the 5th century BCE, it was a relatively minor conflict involving the island of Corcyra that eventually dragged Athens and Sparta into their catastrophic collision. Today, that role is played by a self-ruled island of 24 million people, located just 100 miles off the coast of mainland China. During the 2026 summit in Beijing, it became clear that for both the United States and China, Taiwan is no longer just a diplomatic disagreement. It is the ultimate trigger.
The language used by President Xi Jinping during his private meetings with Donald Trump underscored the existential nature of this flashpoint. He did not speak of Taiwan in the dry, technical terms of trade or maritime law. Instead, he used a visceral metaphor to signal that there was no room for negotiation. He told Trump directly that Taiwan independence and peace in the Taiwan Strait are as irreconcilable as fire and water. This was an unusually harsh admonition, a signal that for Beijing there is no middle ground. From the Chinese perspective, Taiwan represents the final unhealed wound of the century of humiliation, a period when foreign powers carved up Chinese territory. Its reunification is framed as the biggest common denominator for the Chinese people and a non-negotiable requirement for national rejuvenation. She warned that if this issue is mishandled, it will put the entire relationship in great jeopardy, leading inevitably to clashes and even armed confrontation. U.S. diplomatic veterans had entered the summit with a specific anxiety regarding Trump's weave, his signature tangential and improvisational speaking style. There was a palpable fear among experts that an off-script comment on Taiwan or a casual remark intended to be a deal-making overture might be parsed by Beijing to its advantage, potentially emboldening China to test Washington's resolve. This layer of diplomatic tension hung over every session. While Trump had previously joked that the Thucydides Trap sounded like a beautiful name for a golf course, the reality of the 2026 summit saw him trolled relentlessly on X by netizens who pointed out the grim irony of making light of a theory that predicted the very conflict now staring him in the face. The impact of the private exchanges on Taiwan was visible the moment the doors opened. Trump, usually a master of performative bravado, appeared uncharacteristically muted after the session where the island was discussed. Observers noted that he looked serious, thoughtful, and notably old. The weight of Xi's warnings seemed to have settled on him, stripping away the usual campaign trail energy. It was a rare moment where the transactional brilliance of a president who believes everything is a deal met an issue that the other side viewed as a matter of absolute, non-negotiable honor. To understand why this island has become the center of a global security dilemma, we have to look at it through the lens of strategic necessity. For the United States, Taiwan is a critical link in the first island chain, a string of territories that serves as a natural barrier to Chinese naval expansion into the deep Pacific. If Taiwan were to fall under the direct control of Beijing, the United States would lose its ability to monitor and check Chinese maritime movements, fundamentally altering the strategic balance of power in Asia. Furthermore, Washington views its support for Taiwan as a test of its own credibility. If the United States were to step back, its other allies in the region might begin to wonder if American security guarantees are worth the paper they are written on. However, the rivalry over Taiwan is not just about geography or military bases. It is about the very hardware of modern civilization.
The island's dominance in the production of advanced computer chips has created a global dependency that neither side feels it can afford to lose. This technological entanglement has turned Taiwan into a prize of supreme national interest, where control over the factories that power the world's artificial intelligence and defense systems is seen as a zero-sum game. This creates a classic security dilemma, where every move made by one side to ensure its own safety is seen as an act of aggression by the other. In the lead-up to the 2026 summit, the United States approved a massive arms package for Taiwan, intended to help the island defend itself. From Washington's perspective, this was a defensive measure designed to maintain the status quo and deter conflict. But from Beijing's view, it was a provocative act of interference in its domestic affairs. In response, China has dramatically increased the proximity and intensity of its military exercises, with fighter jets frequently crossing the median line and naval vessels simulating the total isolation of the island. Every such maneuver increases the risk of a miscalculation or an accidental collision that could spiral out of control.
Despite the ominous tone of the summit, some experts urged caution against a narrative of total inevitability. Graham Allison, the scholar who popularized the Thucydides Trap concept, provided a necessary counterbalance to the inevitability narrative. He noted that in the current strategic landscape, there remained a less than 1% chance of China blockading Taiwan this year, barring severe provocation. This estimate served as a vital reminder that while the structural pressures are immense, the actors involved still possess agency. The trigger is live, but the finger is not yet on it. The cultural and psychological stakes are just as high as the military ones. For the leadership in Beijing, the status of Taiwan is a matter of national honor. They view the island's functioning sovereignty as an illegal legacy of a civil war that never truly ended. Under President Xi, the narrative has shifted from a distant goal to an urgent historical mission. This is where the Thucydides trap becomes most dangerous. When a rising power feels that its rightful place in the world is being denied by an established power, it can become willing to take risks that seem irrational to outside observers. Xi's warning to Trump was that the United States is playing with fire by cozying up to Taipei. He framed the issue as a choice for Washington: accept China's core interests or face the consequences of a conflict that would devastate the global economy. The 2026 summit provided a rare glimpse into the tension that this issue creates behind closed doors. While the public ceremonies were filled with talk of friendship, the private discussions were reportedly much more stark. Trump sought to encourage Chinese investment and asked for purchases of American goods to reduce the trade deficit, striking a positive tone in public. Yet his muted demeanor following the Taiwan briefings suggested a realization that strategic ambiguity, the long-standing American policy of keeping both sides guessing about a military response, was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain in a high-tension environment. If Beijing believes the U.S. won't fight, they might be tempted to act. If they believe the U.S. is preparing for war, they might feel forced to strike first. Historically, when a rising power and a ruling power have gone to war over a peripheral territory, it is usually because that territory has become a symbol of their relative status. In the Peloponnesian War, Sparta didn't want to fight for Corcyra, but they feared that if Athens gained control of the island's large navy, the balance of power would shift irrevocably. Today, the United States doesn't necessarily want a war over Taiwan, but it fears that if China controls the island, it will dominate the Pacific and the future of technology. This is why the Taiwan issue is so much more than a territorial dispute. It is the place where the economic, military, and ideological ambitions of the 21st century have all converged. The economic consequences of a conflict over the island would be unparalleled. We are no longer living in the age of the 1930s, where nations could retreat into self-sufficiency. Our world is deeply entangled.
A blockade or an invasion of Taiwan would not just stop the flow of consumer electronics, it would cripple the global manufacturing of cars, medical equipment, and defense systems. It would be an economic suicide pact for both the United States and China. This interdependence is often cited as a reason why war is impossible. But history warns us that economic ties are rarely enough to stop a war once the logic of the Thucydides Trap takes hold. When national pride and strategic fear become the driving forces of policy, the Silicon Shield might turn out to be much more fragile than we hope. As the two delegations sat across from each other in the Great Hall of the People, the simulated lawn and flowery bushes between them provided a strange, peaceful contrast to the reality of the missiles and carrier groups positioned just a few hundred miles away. The summit was an attempt to inject stability into a relationship that is being pulled apart by the most powerful structural forces in history. By the end of the first day, both sides agreed that the relationship was the most consequential in the world and that they should be partners rather than rivals. But the warning about Taiwan remained the most significant takeaway from the closed-door sessions. It was a reminder that even if they can agree on trade deficits, the ultimate trigger is still live.
If the Thucydides trap is to be avoided, the two powers will have to find a way to manage the Taiwan issue that satisfies China's need for honor and the United States' need for security. But in a world of increasing nationalism and strategic distrust, the space for such a compromise is narrowing. The 2026 summit showed that while both leaders are willing to talk, they are also digging in their heels. Xi Jinping's invocation of the trap was not just a request for peace. It was a statement that the burden of avoiding war lies with the established power's willingness to accommodate the rising one. The question that hung over the Temple of Heaven as the leaders walked together was whether diplomacy can truly override the cold logic of power transitions. History is littered with the ruins of civilizations that thought they were too interconnected or too advanced to fall into the patterns of the past. As we look at the escalating military maneuvers and the tightening of technological export controls, it is clear that the structural stress is only increasing. If Taiwan is indeed the ultimate trigger, can the human element of leadership, the muted realization of the stakes, overpower the historical momentum toward a collision?
Chapter 3: The Transistor and the Trireme.
In the 5th century BCE, the currency of power was measured in the number of triremes a city-state could launch into the Aegean. These fast, triple-banked warships were the high-tech weaponry of their day, allowing Athens to project influence, protect trade routes, and demand tribute. Today, the trireme has been replaced by the transistor, and the rowing benches have been replaced by the server rack. The structural stress that once existed between land-based Sparta and maritime Athens has evolved into a competition over the very building blocks of the digital age. The modern Thucydides trap is increasingly being sprung in the realm of artificial intelligence. For China, the turning point in this technological rivalry occurred in 2016, a moment that many in Beijing viewed with the same strategic shock that Americans felt during the launch of Sputnik. It happened during a match of Go, a game with over 2,000 years of Chinese cultural history. When an AI system called AlphaGo defeated the world-class human champion, the event was interpreted by the Chinese leadership not just as a feat of engineering, but as a signal that the next industrial revolution had arrived. They realized that the nation that leads in AI will likely lead the world in every other dimension, from financial markets to intelligentized warfare.
By 2017, this realization had solidified into a formal national strategy, the New Generation Artificial Intelligence Development Plan. The goal was to make China the world's primary AI innovation center by 2030 and to build a domestic industry valued at $150 billion. This was a mobilization of the entire state, with universities, private tech firms, and local administrations directed to funnel resources into research and development. This push has been remarkably effective, with China now generating close to 35% of all global scientific publications in the field of AI. However, the structural stress of this rise is felt most acutely in the hardware that makes AI possible. Artificial intelligence is only as powerful as the silicon chips it runs on, and this has led to what many now call the chip war. This is where the modern security dilemma is most visible. The United States has implemented strict export controls designed to limit China's access to high-end semiconductors and the specialized equipment needed to manufacture them. From the American perspective, this is a defensive move to ensure its military edge remains secure. From the perspective of a rising China, it looks like the classic act of containment, an attempt to trap them in a state of technological inferiority.
The center of this hardware struggle is Taiwan, but not merely as a territorial dispute. The island's dominance is staggering. TSMC produces over half of the world's advanced chips and nearly all of the most sophisticated processors used in AI and military hardware. This concentration of production creates a silicon shield that is also a structural stress point. If the flow of these chips were interrupted, the global economy would face a collapse more sudden and severe than any seen in the industrial era. This dependency is a primary driver of the current friction, as both powers realize that whoever controls the foundries of Taiwan controls the speed of the 21st century. The complexity of this technological entanglement was on full display during the 2026 summit in Beijing. Donald Trump arrived with a delegation that included the titans of the American tech world, including Elon Musk, Tim Cook, and Jensen Huang. Their presence was a living testament to the dual nature of modern power. These companies are the engines of American economic dominance, yet they are also deeply dependent on Chinese manufacturing and markets. NVIDIA, for instance, has previously developed adapted versions of its processors specifically to comply with American regulations, while still serving the massive Chinese demand. This illustrates a world where the ruling power is trying to pull back, but the economic gravity of the rising power is almost impossible to escape. While the tech race captures the headlines, the underlying industrial shift is equally profound. The structural stress of decoupling has forced China to double down on self-reliance. Currently, the country imports over $400 billion worth of semiconductors annually, a figure that exceeds what it spends on oil. To close this gap, companies like SMIC and Huawei have received massive state backing to develop domestic alternatives. This push for self-sufficiency is a hallmark of the Thucydides Trap. When a rising power feels its growth is being artificially capped, it will go to extreme lengths to break that dependency. The 2026 summit highlighted a fundamental difference in how the two leaders approach this stress. Trump's focus was heavily transactional, viewing the rivalry as something that could be managed through personal diplomacy and immediate economic wins. Xi, however, viewed the rivalry through the lens of centuries. His perspective was not fixed on the next election, but on a strategic vision where China's industrial and technological reach is accepted as a permanent feature of the global order.
This competition has extended into the ultimate high ground of space. In 2026, the race to the moon has become a central theater of great power rivalry. The United States is accelerating its Artemis program, developing the Space Launch System and the Orion spacecraft with the goal of establishing a sustainable presence on the lunar surface. This sense of urgency is driven by the rapid advances of the China National Space Administration, which has partnered with Russia to promote the International Lunar Research Station. This competing project aims to build a permanent scientific base on the moon by the 2030s. For both powers, the moon represents more than just a scientific frontier. It is a strategic asset. Control over lunar resources and the ability to define the legal frameworks for space exploration are seen as essential for long-term geopolitical leadership. The structural stress is also intensified by the changing nature of warfare.
The Chinese military is pivoting toward what it calls intelligentized warfare, where AI, drone swarms, and cyber operations are integrated into every level of command. This is a disciplined move to offset American conventional advantages. Beijing's official 2026 defense budget of $281 billion reflects a steady 7% increase, with a heavy focus on technology-intensive systems. This military buildup is not just about having more soldiers. It's about having smarter, more connected systems that can challenge the ruling power's ability to operate in the Western Pacific.
The rules of the road for the next generation of technology are now the primary battlefield. This includes the standards for 6G telecommunications and the ethics of AI. The United States has recently narrowed its science and technology agreements to specifically exclude sensitive areas like quantum computing, fearing that a breakthrough in that field could render all current encryption useless. This creates a fractured global tech ecosystem where two separate worlds of software and hardware are beginning to emerge. As the two giants drift apart technologically and industrially, the economic glue that has historically helped prevent conflict begins to dissolve. The paradox of 2026 is that even as the leaders met to discuss stability, the structural pressures were pushing them toward a collision. The competition for rare earth elements and the race for AI supremacy are creating a world where every technological breakthrough is viewed as a zero-sum gain. In the ancient world, a trireme was just a trireme. Today, a single chip can be used for a teenager's video game or for the guidance system of a nuclear missile. This dual-use nature of modern technology makes every trade deal a security risk and every scientific collaboration a potential act of espionage. As the 2026 summit concluded its first day, the world was left to wonder if the transactional optimism of Trump and the strategic warnings of Xi could find a middle ground. But the triremes of the past were limited by the strength of the men who rode them and the wood they were built from. The AI and the technological systems of today have no such natural limits. They are force multipliers that can change the balance of power in an instant, leaving little room for the slow, deliberate work of traditional diplomacy. The question that remains is whether the human leaders can keep pace with the structural stress their own technologies are creating. If the nature of power has fundamentally changed from physical territory to digital supremacy, then the trap itself has also become more volatile. A miscalculation in the age of AI and nuclear-armed superpowers could lead to the end of the very civilization that birthed these technologies. As the two leaders looked toward their final day of talks, the focus began to shift from the hardware of the rivalry to something even more elusive: the way each nation interprets the other's intentions. In a world of shadows and algorithms, how do you know if your rival is preparing for peace or for a war that has been predicted for over 2,000 years?
Chapter 4: The Battle of Interpretation. In the high-stakes world of international relations, facts rarely speak for themselves. Instead, they are filtered through the lenses of culture, history, and domestic politics. During the 2026 summit in Beijing, this reality was on full display. While the world watched the handshakes and the grand tours, a deeper, quieter conflict was taking place, a battle over how to interpret the very concept of the Thucydides Trap. For the two leaders sitting in the Great Hall of the People, the trap was not just a historical theory. It was a narrative tool used to define the rules of their rivalry. How each side chose to read the past would determine whether they were moving toward a managed competition or a catastrophic misunderstanding. For President Xi Jinping, the invocation of the Thucydides Trap is a recurring strategic maneuver. He has been using the term since at least 2014, but his interpretation is markedly different from the one often found in Western military circles. In the Chinese view, the trap is presented as a cautionary tale rather than a predictive law of nature. By raising the question of whether the two nations can transcend the trap, Xi is effectively placing the burden of peace on the established power. The narrative suggests that if the United States can simply overcome its fear of China's rise, conflict can be avoided.
This interpretation allows Beijing to cast itself as a responsible great power, seeking its rightful place, while framing American defensive measures as the alarm that triggers the very instability Washington claims to fear.
This Chinese interpretation is deeply rooted in the century of humiliation. Beijing uses the Thucydides trap as a test of Western fairness. To Xi, the trap is not an abstract geopolitical phenomenon, but a continuation of a historical struggle where Western powers attempt to deny China its sovereign rights. By framing the rivalry this way, Xi suggests that the trap is something the United States must choose to dismantle by accepting a multipolar world. David Daokai Li, a prominent Chinese economist, has gone as far as to call the Thucydides trap a Western intellectual import. He argues that the analogy is fundamentally flawed because it applies the maritime expansionism of an ancient Greek city-state to a continental Chinese civilization that has historically prioritized internal stability and regional harmony. From this perspective, the trap is a Western misdiagnosis of Chinese intentions. However, the battle of interpretation also involves a deeper look at the historical facts of the Peloponnesian War itself. While popular accounts focus on the inevitability of the clash, scholars like Athanasios Platius and Vasilis Trinkas offer a more sobering view based on the Pentakontaechia, the 50-year period of peace and Athenian growth that preceded the war. They argue that the conflict was not an inadvertent slide into war, but the result of a rational, cold-blooded calculation made during this period. In their reading, the war happened because leaders on both sides made specific, calculated decisions to maximize their interests during a time of perceived shift. This adds a layer of systemic interpretation that is often missing. The danger isn't just a trap you fall into, but a series of rational choices that lead to a dead end.
Victor Davis Hanson offers a specific interpretive lens that challenges the optimism of those who look to the past for escape routes. Hanson argues that the Thucydides trap did not apply to the transition between the United Kingdom and the United States because the two nations shared a fundamental political, economic, and cultural DNA. They were both part of a broader Western liberal tradition. The same cannot be said for the United States and China. Because they represent two entirely different and competing systems of governance, the trap is far more potent. For Hanson, the lack of shared values makes the structural stress of a power transition almost impossible to manage through diplomacy alone. This fetishization of ancient history in modern Washington has its fierce critics. James Palmer has bitingly observed that Thucydides shouldn't hold the same grip on the minds of international relations scholars that Harry Potter does on millennial readers. Palmer argues that the obsession with a city-state in a backwater ignores the vast differences between ancient triremes and modern nuclear-armed AI. He suggests that by constantly invoking the trap, policymakers are creating a mental prison that limits creative diplomacy. Arthur Waldron, another prominent critic, dismisses the trap as a quaint piece of ancient history that provides a false sense of inevitability to what are actually modern political failures. These intellectuals argue that by looking for answers in 5th century BCE Greece, we are ignoring the unique, unprecedented challenges of the 21st century.
One of the most profound shifts in this battle involves a challenge to the very idea that China is a rising power. While the Thucydides trap assumes unstoppable growth, a new school of thought suggests the real danger lies in a peaking China. This interpretation argues that the most volatile moment in world politics is not a long, steady rise, but a long rise followed by the prospect of a sharp decline. If the Chinese leadership begins to feel that their window of opportunity is closing due to an aging population, slowing economic growth, or increasing global resistance, they might feel a rational pressure to grab what they can before their power peaks. This peaking power theory flips the trap on its head. The impetus for war doesn't come from the established power's fear, but from the rising power's desperation.
Adding another layer to this interpretive clash is the Kindleberger trap. Popularized by Charles Kindleberger and often cited by Joseph Nye, this theory suggests that the real threat to global stability isn't China's strength, but its potential refusal to provide the global public goods that the world relies on. This was the tragedy of the 1930s, when the United States surpassed Great Britain in power, but failed to take on the responsibilities of leadership, maintaining open markets, stabilizing currencies, and providing security. The result was a vacuum filled by global depression and world war. In this view, the battle of interpretation is about who will lead the international system. If China wants to be a peer superpower, is it willing to help maintain the open seas and the global financial system? Or will it seek the benefits of power without the burdens of leadership?
The 2026 summit provided a fascinating real-time example of these interpretive gaps. After the meetings concluded, Donald Trump took to social media to offer his own take on the proceedings, his public persona quickly pivoting to reclaim the narrative. In a characteristic interpretation, Trump claimed that when Xi referred to a declining nation, he wasn't talking about a structural theory of history, but was instead making a specific political jab at the weakness of previous American administrations. Trump's interpretation was purely transactional and political. He agreed that the nation had been in decline, but insisted that under his own leadership, the U.S. was now the hottest nation anywhere in the world. This highlights a significant risk in great power diplomacy. When one leader speaks in the language of ancient history and structural forces, and the other interprets it through the lens of domestic political branding, the chances for a fundamental misunderstanding are immense. This domestic framing is essential for both sides. In China, state media has latched onto the Thucydides Trap narrative to build a sense of national unity, framing the rivalry as a historical inevitability that justifies economic sacrifice. In the United States, the narrative of a rising challenger is used to build bipartisan support for industrial policy and defense spending.
Beyond these domestic narratives, the Chinese leadership has attempted to create a new interpretive framework: competitive coexistence. This concept tests whether the established power is ready to accept the reality of a rising peer by suggesting that both nationalisms can thrive simultaneously. To the Chinese leadership, this is the only way to transcend the trap. To many in the U.S. State Department, however, this is interpreted as a demand for a sphere of influence that would allow China to dominate its neighbors without outside interference. As the 2026 summit moved into its final stages, the battle of interpretation remained unresolved. The two leaders had agreed on a new strategic position, led by measured competition, but they had not agreed on what those words actually meant in practice. To one side, measured competition meant that the U.S. would continue to lead the global order, while China grew within its limits. To the other, it meant that the U.S. would gradually step back and allow China to take its place as a regional hegemon. Beyond his visceral Taiwan metaphors, Xi was pushing for a world where different political and economic systems could coexist as equals, a definition of order that remains fundamentally at odds with the American vision of a rules-based system.
The significance of this battle over words and meanings is that it defines the security dilemma. If you believe your rival is destined by history to attack you, then every diplomatic overture looks like a trick, and every defensive weapon looks like a preparation for war. The real challenge of the 21st century may not be the rise of China or the decline of the United States, but the ability of both nations to communicate across a deep chasm of interpretive difference. In a world of high-speed information and automated military systems, is it possible that the greatest danger isn't the rise of a new power, but the failure of our own imagination to see a future that doesn't end in the very tragedy we are so obsessed with studying?
Chapter 5. The Architecture of Peace. If history is a gallery of tragedies where rising and ruling powers inevitably collide, there are a few rare, brightly lit hallways where the expected catastrophe never occurred.
These are the cases that haunt the modern diplomat, the 4 instances out of 16 where the Thucydides trap was set but never sprung. As we look at the high-stakes theater of the 2026 Beijing summit, the central question shifts from whether a clash is coming to whether we can replicate the extraordinary statecraft that allowed for peace in the past. To find an escape route from the trap, we have to look at the concept of strategic accommodation, the difficult, often painful process where an established power chooses to make room for a newcomer rather than fighting a war it might not win. The first and perhaps most surprising example of this escape route dates back to the late 15th century, involving the 2 great Iberian powers of the age, Portugal and Spain. For decades, Portugal had been the undisputed master of the seas, led by the seafaring breakthroughs of explorers like Bartholomew Dias. Portugal held the keys to the lucrative trade routes of Africa and the East Indies. But then, almost overnight, a newly unified and rejuvenated Spain emerged as a challenger. When Christopher Columbus returned from the New World in 1493, the structural stress was immediate. Portugal believed these lands belonged to them by right of prior exploration, and both nations began preparing their fleets for a devastating war. Crucially, both powers were already exhausted. They had recently emerged from the War of the Castilian Succession, a brutal conflict that had ended in a weary stalemate. This exhaustion is often a prerequisite for strategic accommodation. It occurs when both sides realize that a decisive victory is impossible or too costly to pursue. What saved the world from a global Iberian conflict was a calculated intervention by an external authority and a willingness to compromise. Pope Alexander VI, recognizing that a war between these 2 Catholic monarchs would be a disaster for the Church's legitimacy, stepped in to arbitrate. The resulting 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas was a masterpiece of strategic accommodation. It drew an imaginary line through the Atlantic, granting Spain everything to the west and Portugal everything to the east. The Portuguese were initially furious, feeling they had been cheated out of the New World, but they ultimately chose to accept the deal. They calculated that their own legitimacy and the stability of their existing trade routes were more important than a total victory over Spain. This agreement held for centuries, proving that when both sides value their own domestic stability more than the absolute balance of power, a basic charter of empire can prevent the trap from closing.
Fast forward to the turn of the 20th century, and we find the most famous escape route of all, the transition of global leadership from Great Britain to the United States. In the 1890s, the United States was a brash, rising power with an economy that had already overtaken Britain's. Tensions were high, particularly over a border dispute in Venezuela in 1895, where the U.S. essentially threatened Britain with war if it didn't accept American arbitration. At that moment, Britain was the world's dominant hegemon, but it was also overstretched, facing a rising challenge from Imperial Germany in Europe. British leaders were forced to make a cold, strategic choice. They could fight the Americans to maintain their supremacy in the Western Hemisphere, or they could accommodate them. They chose accommodation not out of weakness, but out of a brilliant calculation of priority. This period, known as the Great Rapprochement, saw Britain deliberately move over to focus on the German threat. They conceded influence in Venezuela and later supported the American acquisition of the Panama Canal Zone. By making a friend out of a potential rival, Britain transformed a potential Thucydides trap into a special relationship that would define global stability for the next 100 years.
In May of 2026, as Donald Trump and Xi Jinping walked through the Great Hall of the People, the echoes of these historical accommodations were everywhere. The summit was being hailed as the negotiation of the century. The world had just endured the aggressive decoupling of the previous year, and the Beijing summit suggested that both leaders were searching for their own version of a 1494 treaty. Trump, viewing himself as a peace president, saw the possibility of a U.S.-China-led Pax Pacifica, a visionary, if transactional, order where the two giants could coexist as peers. The American delegation included architects of what could be called institutional binding. These figures represented a logic where the cost of springing the Thucydides trap becomes a price that no rational leader is willing to pay. In 2026, the principle that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought has been expanded to include the global economy. If a conflict between the U.S. and China would lead to the total collapse of the global financial system, the material reality forces a level of restraint that traditional diplomacy often fails to achieve.
Just as the Pope acted as an external arbiter in 1494, global market interdependency acted as a form of digital arbiter in 2026. By focusing on shared vulnerabilities, the two powers found a way to cooperate even as they competed in other domains. This required the United States to accept that the unipolar moment of the 1990s is over, and that a new bipolar order has arrived. It requires the ruling power to be wise enough to accommodate change, and the rising power to be restrained enough to show that its growth is not a mortal threat. This shift represents a vital diplomatic guardrail, setting a path for continued engagement to prevent the relationship from sliding back into the kind of rhetoric that often precedes a conflict. However, the path to strategic accommodation is fraught with its own set of dangers. While the 2026 summit utilized business statecraft to create a new set of stakeholders with a vested interest in peace, it also faced the risk of a leadership vacuum. If the U.S. under an America First policy retreats too far from its traditional roles, it creates a vacuum that China might not be ready or willing to fill. Strategic accommodation requires not just moving over, but ensuring that the new arrangement can still provide the global public goods that keep the world functioning. The real lesson of the successful escape routes in history is that avoiding the trap requires an extraordinary level of diplomatic imagination. It requires leaders to find a strategic concept that satisfies the contradictory imperatives to simultaneously compete and cooperate. In 1914, the leaders of Europe failed this test because they allowed their nationalistic pride to narrow their options until war seemed like the only choice. In 2026, the world is betting that the business summit in Beijing has opened up a new corridor of options. As the two leaders looked toward their future engagements in Shenzhen and Miami, the atmosphere was one of cautious optimism. They had proven that they could sit across a table and discuss the most thorny issues without the world ending. But the Thucydides trap is never truly beaten. It is only managed, day by day, decision by decision. The history of the Peloponnesian War is a tragedy because it shows how easily justice and reason are cast aside when fear takes hold. The escape route of strategic accommodation is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of ultimate strength. It is the strength to recognize that the future is not a zero-sum game, and that the destiny of humanity is more important than a temporary advantage in the balance of power. As we watch the server racks process the data of this new bipolar era, we are left with a question that the historical cases of Portugal and Britain cannot fully answer. In an age of artificial intelligence and nuclear weapons, can the digital arbiter of economic necessity hold firm against the ancient visceral forces of national honor and sovereign pride? The Thucydides trap is more than a historical footnote. It is the defining structural challenge of our age. As we've seen through the lens of the 2026 Beijing summit, the rivalry between the United States and China spans every dimension of human progress, from the silicon chips powering AI to the sovereign status of Taiwan. While personal diplomacy and economic entanglement offer temporary stability, the underlying stress of a shifting global order persists. History reminds us that war is not inevitable, but avoiding it requires an extraordinary level of strategic accommodation and the courage to prioritize shared survival over national pride. Ultimately, the question remains, can modern leadership transcend the ancient patterns of power, or are we destined to repeat the tragedies of the past? The choice, as always, rests in human hands. Thank you for listening.